back to Footy A to Z and the Ruck Rovers' retelling of the 2016 Premiership season. Of course, the Fairytale year for the Western Bulldogs. If you haven't already, be sure to catch up on part 1 of this series, which covers the Bulldogs' journey from the 1990s to the end of the 2016 home and away season. But if you are ready to relive one of the best final series in recent AFL history, we'll leave you again in the capable hands of Christian and Alex, as the Bulldogs travel to Subiaco Oval to take on the West Coast Eagles in a do-or-die elimination final.
No team in the modern era has won the Premiership from outside the top 4, let alone the current situation. The only team to ever have done it at all is actually the Adelaide Football Club in 1997 when they win from 5th. And even then, they still had the pleasure of hosting a final in that time or finishing just outside. No one has ever actually won from the position outside the top 4 and certainly never from 7th on the ladder. So by finishing 7th on the ladder, the Western Bulldogs earned themselves the privilege of flying home with their bulldog tails between their bulldog legs, having a week off, and then flying back to play the West Coast Eagles in an elimination final. And this is the part with this story when we are going to be waxing very, very lyrical about this entire run. Because this really, everything we've done at the moment is context setting, right? Everything's letting you know where this club has been and where they've arrived at. But this is where it starts. And it starts from being absolutely destroyed at Subiaco Oval by a lowly team. And when they fly back for their elimination final, the West Coast Eagles have just lost the grand final the previous year to the Hawthorn Football Club. And even though they've finished 6th on the ladder, lots and lots of pundits are tipping them to make a grand final run from 6. I remember that narrative so vividly, and I actually believed it. I thought this was a good team that had underperformed throughout the year and were just starting to get it together now. And what better way to do it than by beating a young team who shouldn't be there on your home deck, a literal continent away from where they are based.
Yeah, and the Bulldogs come back, but they get some massive ins for the elimination final. So as you pointed out, they stumble in the last 6 weeks. And then with that extra week off, they're able to bring back McRae, Liberatore, Easton Wood and Jordan Roughhead. They recall Stringer from the VFL. So they have 5 serious ins for that elimination final. And you feel like that extra week has never helped a team more than the Bulldogs.
So basically they arrive in Perth for a twilight game against the West Coast Eagles and proceed to play some of the best football that this club has ever played. What do you remember from that game? We've actually watched it back recently, and I have a few thoughts. But I want to throw to you first and talk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Eagles kicked the first 2, and I remember watching and just thought, yeah, this is just how it'll go. I'm surprised the Bulldogs are here. And then a switch just gets flipped, and this would be the forerunner for everything that would come throughout the final series. They just blitzed West Coast in the contested ball, and they slammed on 8 in a row from about the halfway mark of the first quarter through to the last 3 minutes of the second, unanswered, just running wave after wave of transition attack football through the middle. It was superb to watch. I remember, there's a hell of a lot of schadenfreude that heads towards West Coast when you're a Dockers fan. And I enjoyed this so much. And they looked so good. And, they kept going in the 3rd and 4th quarter. They just kept smashing them. Jack Darling drops that mark in the 4th quarter. Geez, wasn't that good? They just killed them.
Yeah, well, let's go through.
Killed them.
We should go through this when we do it for the next game, sort of moment by moment. But it starts off, you're right, and the West Coast Eagles kick the first 2. I believe it's from a JK goal and then Jack Darling, while the Western Bulldogs have kicked, I think it's 3 behinds to start the game.
Yeah.
And from then, you're right, it looked over. Things that I also noticed that were quite hilarious were those clash jumpers that the Bulldogs were wearing at the time. Absolutely putrid with that big cartoon bulldog coming across them. And also so many people running past the man on the mark. There was no protected zone at the time. It's just very jarring to look back and see. Basil commentating is just the absolute pits the entire time. But the person
also, how small Caleb Daniel is.
How small... And this begins Caleb Daniel's weird rise to relevancy, which lasts this 4 weeks and in lots of ways is sort of emblematic of this little team that could. But I want to touch on the person who kicks their first goal, I believe, is the real hero of this 4-week run. And it's none other than Liam Picken, who just really, for a lot of respects, didn't look like he was ever going to make it as an AFL footballer. He was always the 22nd guy picked for the Western Bulldogs through a rebuilding team who was actually quite old compared to everyone else at the time, who wore the unfashionable number 42 on his back, had a haircut like he was some sort of 70s rocker who was about 19 years old and hadn't hit puberty yet. And he was this weird mid-sized forward matchup, going with our theme of how weird their forward line was. But he kicks their first goal and it's tied after the first. And then in the second, they just go on an absolute run. The Darling, and Jack Darling has a stinker here. I mean, he plays on at one stage and puts them down by 30 points. What is it? Caleb Daniel is huge. And then, Darling shirking, going back with the flight when the game is lost in the fourth to add insult to injury is really a huge moment for him personally as he goes along. But basically, they beat them in the end quite comprehensively. They beat them 99-52. And I actually have my own personal yarn, if I can share this with you, Alex, because at this time, I was meant to watch this game with my parents, and I couldn't, because they were over in Sydney, and I couldn't go because I'd hurt my ankle. And I was in the hospital waiting room and I was listening to it on the app. And I'll never forget the ABC commentary at one stage in the third quarter yelled out, "Stick a fork in the Eagles because they are done."
Yeah, they were putrid. They were horrible in that game. But, it's credit to the Bulldogs. I mean, I didn't think they would bring that to Subi, and they did, and they won comprehensively. And there was something about this is an ascending narrative. It's the kind of first step is, okay, that's a serious win. It was one of the best wins in the club's history. Great, you've gone over to West Coast, knocked off last year's grand finalist, and you've really smashed them. And I mean, who next week? I mean, it could only be one team next week. UKB.
That's right. Be? So for beating the West Coast Eagles over in Perth, it doesn't get any easier. The Western Bulldogs are sent back to Melbourne. They are sent to the MCG to play the 3-time reigning Premier Hawthorn Football Club. And it is hard to imagine at the time a tougher assignment than going to play a club who have won the last 3 grand finals, and especially in the last 2, although you could also argue in 2013 as well, were never really challenged in any of those games. The way they disposed of Sydney in the 2014 grand final is pure shock and awe as to what they were able to dismantle what many people regarded as a better team. And so that's what the Western Bulldogs face. They've now come up against reality. They've come up against the fact that you can have one big win, but you're now coming up against a team that boasts the likes of Sam Mitchell, Jordan Lewis. They have Luke Hodge. They have Bruce, Puopolo, Jack Gunston, Ben McAvoy, Roughhead as well, anchoring the entire thing.
Cyril, Brad Hill.
It's absolutely insane. And that game begins, and Hawthorn look incredible. And they're hitting targets at will. They're doing everything you expect Hawthorn to do, so much so that the Bulldogs are in shock. They're down 22-3 early after a huge Rioli run down and goal. And of all people, Easton Wood, who is their fill-in captain at this point because Bob Murphy has gone down, goes forward and stops the rot. But essentially, Hawthorn are clowning them. Hawthorn are absolutely clowning them on the MCG in front of everyone to see. But there is, for me, a moment. And the moment comes in the second quarter where the Bulldogs get a goal, but then there's a centre bounce and the ball goes up. And after a brief skirmish, Roughhead, their ruckman, held together by tape, it seems like at this point, we've barely mentioned him, storms out of the middle of the ground and bangs it long inside 50. And we have a more symbolic matchup I cannot imagine. You have Marcus Bontempelli on Luke Hodge. And what happens next, Alex?
Well, Roughhead kicks it to the one-on-one, and Bontempelli just uses his brute strength to strong-arm Hodge off him as he falls backwards and takes the mark. And then the great champion Hodge has a few words to say. He's unimpressed. Bontempelli goes back and obviously slots the goal.
What a moment that was. And I must also say, I'm going to continue my also personal narrative for this, because as I mentioned, my parents were over for this. And I was meant to watch this game with my parents in their hotel room. But talking about hospitals and things, it was such a weird thing to have happen. My mum actually fell and broke her hip. And so we ended up being in the hospital with her, and she asked if we could put on the game. And so on my phone, we were listening to the ABC broadcast of this game, lying there with her, listening to the Doggies get back in this game.
Do you know what? I wonder whether the reason why the Bulldogs won, is it the case that the Bulldogs won the Premiership because each week before the game, a Barron family member got injured and ended up in hospital?
Well, this is the last time that...
Was that the key to their success?
Yeah, well, if we're doing anything for the Dockers, I'd be going around kneecapping everyone in my extended family, but I don't think it quite works that way, unfortunately.
No.
But yeah, it was so funny. I was in there, with my own ankle, as I said, after a basketball thing. And then the next week we're meant to watch this game together, and she ends up falling and hurting herself. And the thing we kind of do to get by while she's waiting for the surgeon to be ready is put on the game and have a listen. And I remember I didn't get to see that moment, but I heard it on the radio. And it really was this young pup really going up to a 2-time Norm Smith medalist and a 4-time premiership player and just absolutely bodying him in front of everyone. Mm. And for me, looking at the sort of score worm and so on, it really becomes... Clay Smith kicks another big goal in the second term to really drag
Stringer gets a serious roving goal as well in the second.
Oh, that's there. Yeah, in the second half, the package delivers a huge goal. That flying snap, yeah.
The flying snap where he does the double hop. For
he
all of
does
those who played amateur cricket and ever seen someone come into bowl with the double hop, Stringer somehow double hops off his left and then snaps from 35. Just an all-time classic package goal.
Yeah.
And, that's when they hit the lead for the first time, is that goal.
And they go on a 6-goal run in the third quarter, and it culminates with Picken running into an open goal, which in many respects is a portent of things to come. And he ends up kicking 3 in the game. And they end the premiership, the triple premiership reign of the Hawthorn Football Club, having defeated the other grand finalists the week before over in Perth. It is absolutely amazing that they're able to do this. And they're only the second team since 1988 that has won through to a preliminary final from 7th. It's amazing.
They end the dynasty.
They ended
the Hawks dynasty.
The Hawks go into a mini wilderness of their own, which we're still seeing right now, really. I mean, they might end up finishing top 4 again as they did last year, but it's a false dawn, really.
Yes, it seems unlikely this year, but that was the end of days for them. That great side who you still thought would have it in them, just the young pups just do them in the second half, and that's it.
It's so good.
For Hawthorn.
It is so good.
and it's just ascending. They've beaten the Eagles for the upset. They've faced the champs. They've knocked the champs out. They've ended their era. And then doesn't it get good because the preliminary final, they go to Sydney, they play the Giants. That is an all-time classic.
Well, not only that, not only is it a classic game, but it's a classic build-up. Because as we have mentioned, going all the way back to the Ryan Griffin trade, These two clubs do not like each other, number one. And there also couldn't be a bigger disparity in the narratives that surround them. You have on the one hand, they're both from the west of their respective cities. They both have a working class sort of background and supporter base. That's probably all you could probably say that really unites them in many respects. But you have this old Victorian club who are storming into the preliminary final up in Sydney, who have this history behind them that is so torrid and so drenched in it that they can't really see anything from it. On the other hand, you have what many people regard at the time as the AFL's Ferrari, this fast car, this flashy thing that they've built in a few years that is just destined to go on and win 5 premierships in a row, much to the chagrin of every single fan who's followed their team for years and years and years. Because the Greater Western Sydney have not been in the competition long. They have been stockpiling draft picks specifically for this moment and had list concessions and everything else and had a stadium built for them. And the Western Bulldogs have to run up on, as they have done so many times, upon millions and millions of dollars of which they really can't compete with. And I should also say I was there at this game. And what was amazing about it is I've been to so many Greater Western Sydney games. And I went with my dad because my mum was recovering, and so I took my dad with me. And we sat behind the goals. And I've been to that stadium so many times and seen it, not very full or sort of empty and stuff. And this was like 50-50. It was as if it was a finals game in Melbourne, but on a much smaller and more intimate ground. And there's just never been a bigger disparity between these GWS fans who, in many respects, feel like they should win the premiership. I mean, I was there 2 weeks before when they tuned up the Swans by, I must have been 30-odd points or something like that to reach this point. I mean, they absolutely wiped them off the park, and they were rolling into this preliminary final on their home deck. And the Western Bulldogs have just slugged it out in Perth, slugged it out against the 3-time reigning premiers, and now have to fly up to Sydney to play this multi-million-dollar juggernaut.
Yeah, the Rolls-Royce versus the team built of spit and glue. And so many Bulldogs fans made the journey, didn't they? There was a real split in the crowd. What was the banner? Something about your team was built in focus groups was one of the Bulldogs banners that year.
We also forgot Callan Ward. Callan Ward is now the Greater Western Sydney captain who left the Western Bulldogs as well. So there's so much animosity.
There's a lot of kind of narrative between the two clubs.
The Orange Tsunami, that's what they were called at the time. They were all run and dare and handball, and all their good players were, Cornelio, Kelly, Shield. They were all about 22 years old and just absolutely running amok.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy Cameron, Toby Green, Jonathan Patton, Rory Lobb, Phil Davis,
Nick Haynes,
Lockie Whitfield, Haynes. I mean, it's rolled gold. As you say, that's a team that's been built to win a premiership by design by the AFL. And then these two start slugging it out, and it's an absolute classic.
It is tight the whole game. It is absolutely no one can land a knockout blow, I should say. I also just like reflecting on the fact that their forward line is Picken, Clay Smith, Stringer, Dixon, who is a forgotten man in this. The plumber himself, the most accurate kick at goal, but just looks like a cabbage who became sentient. And then a backline I want to mention as well of Joel Hamling, Boyd, Morris, Easton Wood, and JJ. Just a motley crew again of just people who are trying their best to get it done. And as we mentioned, it is absolutely tight the entire game. Clay Smith ends up having 4 goals and 26 touches. He delivers on being pick 17 right after the rebuild. And after the GWS, they wouldn't even had that pick had they normally picked in the ladder, but because GWS had so many concessions, he fell to them. He ends up betraying them for that fact with 4 goals and 26 touches. But the real moment happens, the first of many, in the final quarter, where Jason Johannesson stamps his authority on this game. And there is a loose ball on the halfback flank, And I was facing away from where he runs here. But Johannesson grabs the ball at speed, and it's bobbling anywhere, no one can get a handle on it, and he splits a pack, and he slams the ball right in front of Marcus Bontempelli, who lopes out after it, gathers, and just with about 2 steps, as nonchalantly as you like, bangs it through the middle. And before that moment, it was 74-69, and the Bulldogs hit the front at that moment.
Yeah. Cordy kicks one a minute after that, and Patton would answer a minute later. So scores are level with 3 to go. And I don't know, KB, you were there, if you remember what ends up being the winning goal is Liberatore from a pack. In some ways, replicating the moment his father had to Jack McRae, who's got out the back, kind of 40 out.
Yeah, well, no, what's interesting to me is actually how fickle things can be and how just, random chance sort of intervenes. So with 3:33 to play, there's a wing stoppage, and it is anyone's ball, anyone's game, 82 apiece. And Libba gets the clearance, which is fantastic, but he slaps the ball on his boot, and he slaps it high. It sails into the Sydney night air, and it's swirling, and it's barely gone far enough to be paid. And they all gather at half forward for the drop of the ball. And Nick Haynes, an intercept specialist, actually arrives there first. And he slams the ball back away from his goal, back into the middle of the ground. And this is an interesting moment. So Libra's had the moment to really bang them inside forward 50. He hasn't managed to do it. And then Cornelio goes to gather the ball, but he's being worn so hard by Marcus Bontempelli. All he can do is paddle it on back the way the ball's already going from Nick Haynes' fist. And that leads it directly into Liberatore's path again. And now he's in space and he's arcing around onto his left boot. And so having just slapped the ball forward haphazardly, he now has time to steady and assess his options. And at that moment, one of the men who symbolizes this rebuild, Jack McRae, pick number 5 in the 2012 draft, as you say, has leaked out the back. And I remember, because in all the chaos of when things are going, you're not really at the ground looking at what the player is looking at. You just can't believe he's got the ball and where he's going to spend it. And as soon as he slapped that ball on his boot, he had seen something that I hadn't. And I looked where it was going and I saw Jack McRae leaking out, and I thought that was the game.
Well, it's the game if he ices it. And Jack McRae had spent a number of years kind of not quite living up to the expectation of a high draft pick. He was taken before Stringer. There were periods when he was dropped because his defensive efforts weren't good enough. And then he just came on. I mean, he, like so many of the mids, like Dalhouse, like Bont, like Libba, they just became experts. The fast handball and their contested work in that finals series was excellent. And all of them were fantastic in that space. And so here's someone who, has a chance to have his moment. And 3 minutes left in a high-pressure game where, at this point, every goal is worth more than gold. He slots it. And so, they're up. They're up again. And they don't relinquish that lead.
No, they don't. Tory Dixon, the plumber himself, kicks the ceiling goal, but it makes the margin look bigger than it actually sort of was and is, because it was tight the entire way. And we should have also mentioned that Tom Boyd arrives in this game. He's playing in the ruck, basically out of necessity to ruck support Roughhead, as well as swinging forward. And I believe he has 3 goals in that game. But more importantly, just towers over everyone, taking a huge amount of pack marks. I might be wrong on the 3 goals.
You're right that he just started. All of a sudden, Tom Boyd starts clunking.
Yeah, but he starts clunking them on the wing, and he's a real get out of jail. And that moment when the scores are tied and you need to have a contested mark on your wing, he stands up. And it is quite phenomenal to see. So he has his coming out party against his old side and delivers on that promise of the quote-unquote big key forward that they've needed for so long. But in classic Western Bulldogs unconventional fashion, that he has to be thrown in the ruck to really do it.
Spit and glue.
Spit and glue, and his $1 million eclipses all the $1 million that all the GWS has at their disposal, and they go down in a year that they probably were flag favourites in the end. But all of that leads us to the last Saturday in September, and the Western Bulldogs then, after all of this, having beat the Eagles in Perth, beating the 3-time reigning premiers, the Hawthorn Hawks, going up and facing the new glamour team of the AFL with their new stadium and high draft picks and beating them on their home deck. They then have to fly down to the MCG for the grand final and play one of the most fearsome and professional outfits the modern era has ever known. They have to play the Sydney Swans. In the build-up to the grand final, what did you think about this?
I thought Sydney would just do them like a dinner. Sydney were exceptional that year. As you say, they were very professional. They had Hannanbury, Parker, Kennedy, who were as fearsome a midfield trio as there was in the competition. Had Lance Franklin, had Isaac Heaney. I just thought, you know what, this is a great story by the Bulldogs, but I feel like it's going to end here. I know they're there. I know everything they've done. I want to believe it because, you know, we live for these stories. We live for the story of the underdog, of the fairy tale, but that's just not how I understand the world to be. That's not how it goes.
I agree completely. I remember simply asking people who was the matchup for Buddy Franklin, and no one could tell me. And I said, well, that's the game right there. Among so many other factors, I just didn't believe in fairy tales. I didn't believe that this club could go through all of this and simply walk into the MCG and win against a side like the Sydney Swans, who had been there 2 years earlier and had been there 2 years before that. This was a team that knew a grand final intimately, who had players who had been there several times. And I just didn't see a world in which that could happen. And so I don't think many people did. I mean, no one has won the Premiership from 7th position. No one has won outside the top 8 ever. And eventually, and that is for reasons. Those are for mathematical, real, tangible advantages that hosting games at home and having second chances affords you. And I thought that was all going to come undone now. So we should start in the first quarter, and the first bit of luck breaks the Western Bulldogs' way, and that is that Buddy Franklin stands on a teammate's foot and tweaks his ankle, which puts him hobbling for the rest of the game and enters Joel Hamling has entered the chat by this stage. Like, he gets to play on a reduced Buddy Franklin and really is able to have an impact through that. But in the very first quarter, the Swans' defense looks incredible. They are intercept marking the Western Bulldogs at will. They look like a team who has been there before and knows what's going to happen. The Western Bulldogs look like they just need to slam it on the boot and get it there as fast as humanly possible.
Yeah, I mean, the Swans' backline, incredibly professional. I mean, you had Rampy, you had Grundy, you had Mills. Parker kicks the first goal of the game, and you just think that's a portent of things to come. You remember Josh Kennedy plays that unbelievable first half.
Plays an unbelievable game.
Touches. He plays an unbelievable game. He has more than 20 and kicks 2 in the first half. And yeah, he was incredible. I mean, you think, you know, if it's closer, maybe he wins the norm. I remember Callum Mills in the back pocket tries to sell some candy to Ace Cordy, who absolutely buries him in a tackle. And Ace Cordy, who's about as unfashionable as you can get, slots the goal from the ensuing free kick. And 2 minutes into the second quarter, Tom Boyd takes a sliding mark in the right forward pocket. And because Tom Boyd is now Errol Flynn and Lance Franklin rolled into one, he just wheels around on his left and dutifully snaps the goal. Like, yeah, gosh, obviously, look how much money I'm making. I'm all of a sudden a superstar.
Yeah, but
and he played like one.
Exactly, but even then, they're manufacturing these flying snaps, you know what I mean? Whereas Josh Kennedy is busting through tackles and kicking it straight through the eye, diddle diddle. So in the second quarter, he kicks 2 goals in a row, and they're 2 bustling stoppage goals in which he wills himself free and slams it on the boot to get it forward. And it really looked at that stage like the game might be taken away from them by this one man's sheer will alone. And so and Stringer is awful. Stringer is MIA in this entire game, and McRae is absolutely trying his heart out. He is battling so hard. And at the half, it's a bit of a seesawing context. The Bulldogs come back in, but at 3/4 time, it's very, very close in the grand final. Closer than I ever thought it would be. And then...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, do you want to go back a bit?
Well, I mean, the Dogs take a narrow lead into the last. You remember Easton Wood practically maims Dan Hanbury.
Well, that's the exact moment I wanted to get to next. That was a huge turning point in which there's a loose ball and Easton Wood cannons into Daniel Hanbury's medial ligament and essentially renders him hobbling for the rest of the game. And then a series of just amazing things happen. There's a bomb to the, not quite the hot zone, a bit outside of that. And Liam Picken, of all people, roves it like a small forward, like a Darren Jarman, if you will, and absolutely buries it through the goals, as well as takes an incredibly huge hanger in which he's up in the air forever and seems to take it only inches from the ground in the end. He is playing out of his skin. And the Bulldogs managed to drag themselves a little bit clear.
Yeah. King of the good boys medium-sized forward club. I know we've spoken about the bad boys medium-sized forward club, but maybe it's just one is Liam Picken.
Yeah, I think so.
The moment, there were two moments after that. The moment I will never forget is Franklin. Callum Mills squares one from the halfback.
And I should say, we're going to there's 5 minutes 24 to go, and the score is 66-75 to the Bullies. So it is there for anyone to win, but Bulldogs have established a little buffer.
They've got a little buffer, but you think it's still too close to call. Mills squares the ball. Franklin drops a mark. It bobbles around. Franklin picks it up. He starts to wheel around to pump the ball towards the 50. And I don't know if he's Harold or Alfred by our neighbour's home and away analogy, but Dale Morris grabs him from behind, tackles him, strips him of the ball, and Tom Boyd just picks the ball up.
The ball if I can tell you, the ball spills free, and Tom Boyd, who again is playing like $1 million, gathers the ball inside the centre square, and I'll throw it back over to you to tell what happens next.
Tom Boyd just turns, takes a step or two, and just lets loose from 70. If you go on YouTube, you can basically grab 5 or 6 different points of view from various radio and TV commentators at that moment. He launches from 70, and the ball lands on its point in the square, and it rolls and it rolls and it rolls the right way. And Jared Waitley, as that moment happens, says, "The gods are on the Dogs' side." Dennis Cometti says, "The stadium holds its breath." And Brian Taylor says a few things before very famously swearing. And Tom Boyd just puts both his arms out and just marches towards the fans. And it is an all-time grand final moment will never forget.
With Toby McLean draped all over him as well, as if he's picking up the entire Western Bulldogs club history and carrying it on his shoulders. Do we want to play a little bit of that commentary now? We haven't done this before on the air. Should we give it a go?
Yeah, I think maybe we should play...
Oh, the other?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Look, there's Dennis's call... or there's BT's call. They're both good for different reasons. I'll leave it to your discretion.
I just want to hear the roar of the crowd. Let's see if this works quickly.
In front, Franklin, knocked away by Morris. Naismith sold a teammate into trouble. Quick thinking by Kennedy. And Franklin was run down. Tom Boyd's got it. Tom Boyd goes long. How will it bounce? The stadium holds its breath. It's a goal. And the Western suburbs erupt.
How good is that? Gives you goosebumps. It gives you goosebumps.
That was a great moment. Then you think it's getting close to done, and then there's a squaring ball from outside the 50, and Liam Picken at the top of the square manages to knock the ball forward as his opponent falls away and run into an open square.
As he did all those weeks ago.
And he just runs through with those low shoulders, arms beside him, in a trademark celebration that he came to be known for throughout the finals series. And in that moment, I don't know what you thought, KB, but I thought all is right in our world.
I didn't think such a thing was possible. I didn't realize that in a sport that involves so much competing money and history and interests and personalities, that something just so epic but also so pure could just present itself like that, that so much longing could be undone in such an unfathomable way. I just had never seen anything quite like it. And given where this club had been and had just been this footnote compared to other people's narratives and to the city of Melbourne more generally, to deliver itself in the hardest way possible in such just absolutely gobsmacking fashion. I couldn't believe it at the time. I was dumbfounded. And I absolutely loved it. I was out of my chair the entire time watching that grand final. But I think to end with, so the siren goes and the Western Bulldogs have won it. And as Dennis Cometti says, the Western suburbs erupt. And there is just absolute adulation from the fans and the players, and no one can believe they've done it. And Jason Johannesson wins the medal, although I still think to this day, if you ask people what they remember from that grand final, it is Tom Boyd.
And Liam Picken,
and Liam Picken probably, and McRae to a degree through the midfield as well. But I remember Tom Boyd with, I think it was 3 goals and 8 marks, 6 of which were contested. And at the very end, Luke Beveridge, the understated coach, the person who picked up all of the pieces after the Ryan Griffin fiasco in 2014, has his speech, congratulating everyone. And he's kind of going through the motions a little bit. He's an understated guy. And he's talking in very clipped sentences, just saying how good it was and thanks for the fans and good work to the players. And he goes to leave. And before he does, he just quickly comes back on the microphone and says, one more thing. I'd like to invite Bob Murphy up onto the stand with me. And which culminates in probably the most heartwarming moment in the AFL that I can remember, where the man who had been there through all the failed preliminary finals, who had captained this club through a rebuild, knowing he could have left like the likes of Sean Higgins and people did, but he saw it as his duty to steward this club through this next phase, only for them to arrive at the promised land, the moment when they win, pardon me, the flag. And he is not able to be out there in his last season, and his coach invites him up onto the stage to lift the Premiership Cup instead of him. I don't know about you, but that is for me just the most amazing end to this story.
He lifts the trophy with Easton Wood and he just looks at the sky and there's tears and joy, and it's the most perfect sporting moment.
And that's the yarn of the Western Bulldogs 2016 flag. How good was that?
It was a thing of beauty. It was as beautiful remembering it with UKB.
Yeah, I don't know how long this podcast is, but I am not editing it. We are going to, if it's 2 hours long, hey, strap yourself in. Hope you've got a long commute to listen to that one, because, it's just so good. It is so good.
I feel so much better after that. That's just made my day.
Hey, let's wrap it up here. First of all, as we always say, thanks so much for listening. Please rate and review us on iTunes. We are on Spotify. We are on Facebook. We are Instagram at the Ruck Rover, and also Twitter. We are at Ruck Rover Pod. Alex, as always, it's good to chat to you, buddy.
KB, it's been a pleasure.